When people hear the name Henry Ford, one image instantly comes to mind: the Model T, the little black car that put the world on wheels, the car that rolled out of Detroit and into history books, the machine that transformed ordinary Americans into drivers. By 1927, the Model T had sold over 15 million units, a record that would stand for decades. It was not just a car, it was a revolution. But here's the question: what happens to a man after he changes the world once? That's where Henry Ford's story gets even more fascinating. The end of the Model T era wasn't the end of Ford's influence. Instead, it opened a new chapter filled with bold experiments, bitter controversies, staggering failures, and unexpected triumphs. From ambitious new car designs to failed utopian cities in the Amazon, from clashes with labor, unions to wartime bomber factories, Henry Ford's life after the Model T is a tale of both brilliance and stubbornness. This isn't just the story of a man who built cars. It's the story of a man who tried to shape the future, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously, but always in his own way. The end of the Model T era, 1927. By the mid-1920s, the Model T had become both Ford's greatest triumph and his biggest obstacle. For nearly 2 decades, the car dominated the roads. Cheap, durable, and reliable, it was everything the average person needed. But the world was changing fast. Competitors like General Motors were offering stylish vehicles with colors, comfort, and new technology. People wanted cars that weren't just practical. They wanted cars that looked modern and made a statement. Henry Ford, however, refused to let go. He was famously stubborn about the Model T. While his competitors experimented with yearly updates, Ford believed in one simple product for everyone. He once said, "The customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long as it is black." That stubbornness worked in 1908, but by 1926 it was starting to look out of touch. Sales plummeted. Dealerships struggled. For the first time, Ford Motor Company was being overshadowed. Finally, in May 1927, Ford shut down Model T production. The very last car rolled off the assembly line, and Henry himself ceremoniously drove it. Tears were shed, but reality had set in. The man who had revolutionized the world now faced a new challenge, proving that lightning could strike twice. The birth of the Model A. When the Model T era closed, the world held its breath. Could Henry Ford repeat his miracle? For months, Ford Motor Company halted car production entirely, a risky gamble. When competitors like Chevrolet and Chrysler were stealing customers every day, behind the factory walls, engineers worked furiously on something new. This wasn't just another version of the Model T. It had to be a car that showed the world Ford still mattered. By late 1927, the result was unveiled: the Model A. The car was a complete departure from Ford's earlier philosophy. It came in multiple colors, had better styling, and included modern features like safety glass in the windshield. It wasn't revolutionary in the way the Model T was, but it was a step into the modern age. The public responded with enthusiasm. Crowds lined up outside dealerships. The first few years of sales were strong, and Ford proved he could still command attention. Yet, beneath the excitement, cracks began to show. General Motors had developed a powerful strategy, offering different brands for different income levels, refreshing designs every year, and using flashy advertising. The Model A, while popular, wasn't enough to stop Ford's gradual decline in market share. Henry had succeeded in replacing the Model T, but he had lost the monopoly he once held. For a man who had built his empire on the idea of one car for everyone, this new reality was hard to accept. Henry Ford was learning that the world he had created was evolving without him. Beyond cars, factories, and labor, Henry Ford wasn't just known for his cars, he was equally famous for his factories. Years earlier, he had revolutionized production with the moving assembly line, cutting the time to build a car from more than 12 hours to just 90 minutes. After the Model T, he doubled down on this idea of efficiency. One of his boldest moves came in 1914 when he introduced the $5 workday, a wage that doubled the average pay for factory workers. At first, it shocked the business world. Why would a company pay workers so much? But Ford's reasoning was simple: better paid. Workers would not only build cars, but they could also afford to buy them. It was a radical idea that helped create America's middle class, but by the 1930s, this vision began to sour. Ford hated labor unions and fought fiercely to keep them out of his company. His sociological department even monitored workers' private lives, checking if they drank alcohol, saved money, or lived properly. For Ford, efficiency wasn't just about machines, it was about controlling people. This control led to ugly confrontations. The most infamous came in 1937, during what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Union organizers from the United Auto Workers. Workers tried to hand out leaflets at Ford's Rouge plant. Ford's security men brutally beat them in broad daylight, and photographers captured every moment. The images shocked the nation, and Ford's reputation as a benevolent employer was badly damaged. Henry Ford had always believed he was doing what was best for workers, but by refusing to accept their demands for rights and representation, he found himself on the wrong side of history. His factories had once symbolized progress. Now they were becoming symbols of conflict. Henry Ford's experiments. Henry Ford was never content with just building cars. To him, every problem had a mechanical solution, and every industry was a puzzle waiting for his genius to solve. After the Model T era, he poured enormous energy into experiments that were as ambitious as they were unusual. One of the most infamous was Fordlandia. In the late 1920s, Ford realized that his cars depended heavily on rubber essential for tires and countless parts. Most rubber came from plantations controlled by European powers in Southeast Asia, leaving Ford at the mercy of foreign suppliers. His solution: create a massive rubber plantation deep in the Brazilian Amazon. On paper, it sounded brilliant. A self-sufficient supply of rubber combined with Ford's vision of building a utopian community for workers. But reality was cruel. The Amazon rainforest proved unforgiving. The soil wasn't suitable. Insects destroyed the trees. And workers resisted Ford's attempts to impose Midwestern American lifestyles, from square dances to rigid work schedules. Fordlandia became a chaotic blend of cultural misunderstanding and agricultural disaster. By the 1940s, it was abandoned, a ghost town swallowed by the jungle. This wasn't Ford's only grand scheme. Obsessed with vertical integration, he tried to control every part of the supply chain. His company owned forests for lumber, iron mines, for steel, even railroads and ships. The idea was to free Ford Motor Company from relying on outsiders. In some cases, it worked, giving Ford greater independence. In others, it became a costly distraction. These experiments revealed the two sides of Henry Ford. On one hand, he was a visionary who thought far beyond the automobile. On the other, he was a stubborn dreamer who often underestimated how complex the real world could be. For every breakthrough, there was a failure that showed Ford's limits as a businessman and as a human being. The 1930s and the Great Depression. The 1930s were a storm for everyone, and Henry Ford was no exception. The Great Depression crushed industries across America, and car sales plummeted. Families that once dreamed of owning a car were now struggling to buy bread. Ford's company, though still massive, faced growing competition. General Motors surged ahead, offering stylish cars in multiple price ranges and marketing them with flashy advertising campaigns. Chevrolet became a household name, while Ford clung stubbornly to older ideas. He resisted annual model changes, believing they were wasteful gimmicks. To customers, however, they were exciting, and Ford's cars began to look outdated. Inside the company, tensions grew. Henry's son, Edsel Ford, had become president of Ford Motor Company. Edsel was more open to design, innovation, and modernization, but Henry constantly overruled him. Father and son clashed repeatedly, with Edsel often frustrated by his father's unwillingness to adapt. Meanwhile, Ford's relationship with labor worsened. His refusal to allow unions hardened, even as workers across the country demanded representation. The Battle of the Overpass in 1937 showed just how brutal things had become. Images of bloodied union organizers stunned the nation, and Ford's once heroic image as the man who gave workers a fair wage now seemed like a distant memory. The 1930s revealed a painful truth. While Henry Ford had revolutionized the early 20th century, he was struggling to keep up with the changing world of the 1930s. His company survived, but its dominance was fading. War and the Willow Run factory. When the 1940s arrived, America was inching closer to involvement in World War II. At first, Henry Ford was reluctant. He had long opposed war and once even tried to promote peace through eccentric projects like sending a peace ship to Europe during World War I. But as global conflict intensified, Ford Motor Company was drawn into one of the largest industrial efforts in history. The centerpiece of Ford's wartime contribution was the Willow Run plant in Michigan. Here, Ford aimed to do for airplanes what he had once done for cars: apply mass production. The focus was on building the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that was desperately needed by the Allied forces. At its peak, Willow Run became one of the largest factories in the world, covering 3.5 million square feet. Engineers and workers applied Ford's assembly line principles to aviation, something many doubted could be done. Airplanes were far more complex than cars, with thousands of precision parts. Yet Ford's determination paid off. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 every hour, a staggering achievement that symbolized America's industrial might. The plant became a symbol of teamwork. Thousands of workers, including women who took on roles traditionally reserved for men, filled its assembly lines. The Rosie the Riveter generation helped build the bombers that flew over Europe and the Pacific. For Ford, it was proof that his vision of mass production could adapt to any challenge. Yet even here, Henry's personal contradictions showed. While his factories were essential to the war effort, Ford himself still held isolationist views. His public image remained complicated, admired for his industrial genius, but criticized for his politics. Still, by the end of the war, Willow Run had cemented Ford's role in history, not just as the man who built cars, but as a vital part of America's victory. Henry Ford, the man behind the factories and machines, was a man full of contradictions. Henry Ford was brilliant, determined, and visionary, but also deeply flawed. His relationship with his son, Edsel Ford, was one of the most tragic parts of his story. Edsel was creative, forward-thinking, and eager to modernize the company. He supported new designs, stylish cars, and smoother management. But Henry constantly dismissed him, often humiliating him in front of executives. The stress took a toll on Edsel's health, and in 1943, at just 49 years old, Edsel died of cancer. Many believed the endless conflict with his father accelerated his decline. Henry was devastated, but by then it was too late for reconciliation. Henry Ford also carried controversial beliefs that stained his legacy. He published anti-Semitic writings in the 1920s, which were widely condemned and later disowned, but they damaged his reputation permanently. Politically, he flirted with fringe ideas and often distrusted modern institutions. These darker aspects of his personality made him a controversial figure in his later years. By the 1940s, Henry's health began to fail. After Edsel's death, he briefly returned as president of the company, but he was no longer capable of running it effectively. The business was slipping, morale was low, and it was clear that Ford Motor Company needed new leadership. Henry Ford's stubborn refusal to let go of power showed the human side of his genius. The same determination that had built an empire was now preventing him from gracefully stepping aside. The final years and death. After Edsel's passing in 1943, Ford Motor Company entered a turbulent phase. Henry, by then in his 80s, briefly took back the role of company president. But the Henry Ford of the 1940s was not the energetic, hands-on leader of the Model T days. His health was failing, his memory was inconsistent, and his decision-making became erratic. The U.S. government, worried that the company's poor management could affect wartime production, pressured the Ford family to act. In 1945, Henry's grandson, Henry Ford II, stepped into leadership. The young HF2, as he was called, immediately began restructuring the company, bringing in professional managers and modernizing its operations. It was the official end of Henry Ford's direct control. The old man spent his final years quietly at his estate, Fair Lane, in Dearborn, Michigan. Longer in the spotlight, he watched the company he built transition into a new era without him. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 83. At the time of his death, his personal fortune made him one of the richest men in America. Tens of thousands of people attended his funeral. For many, he was the man who had made the automobile affordable. For others, he was a complex figure, an industrial giant whose genius was matched by his flaws. More than a car maker, Henry Ford, after the Model T, was not the same man who had once shocked the world with a simple, affordable car. The man who once declared he would build a motor car for the great multitude had already accomplished that dream by 1927. He had changed the way people lived, worked, and moved. But life after the Model T proved that genius is never simple. It's messy, contradictory, and often shadowed by flaws. By the late 1920s, Ford was older, set in his ways, and increasingly out of step with a changing America. Competitors like General Motors were dazzling buyers with colorful cars and clever marketing, while Ford still clung to his one car for everyone philosophy. In some ways, his stubbornness slowed him down. Yet even in his later years, he remained restless. He still dreamed, still built, and still tried to push boundaries. The Model A showed he could pivot when pressed. Willow Run proved his production genius could scale to heights unimaginable. And Finlandia, though a failure, revealed his hunger to shape not just machines but entire societies. This contradiction is what makes Henry Ford's post-Model T years so fascinating. On one hand, he was the heroic innovator, the man who had raised wages and given dignity to millions of workers. On the other hand, he was the employer who fought against unions whose security men were caught on camera beating organizers at the Battle of the Overpass. He was both the giver of opportunity and an obstacle to progress. Perhaps the most tragic part of his later life was his relationship with his son, Edsel Ford. Edsel was gentle, artistic, and forward-looking, everything Henry was not. Where Henry preferred plainness, Edsel appreciated elegance. Where Henry resisted change, Edsel embraced it. But instead of nurturing his son's vision, Henry often stifled it. Their clashes left scars, and Edsel's early death in 1943 was a blow that Henry never recovered from. Many who knew them believed Henry's relentless pressure and refusal to share power weighed heavily on Edsel's health. It was the kind of personal tragedy that revealed Henry Ford not just as an icon, but as a flawed father. And then there were Ford's ideas, some brilliant, some unsettling. His push for vertical integration reshaped industry. His $5 workday changed labor economics forever. Yet his writings filled with prejudice, and his flirtations with isolationist politics stained his reputation. These contradictions make him difficult to categorize neatly as hero or villain. He was both at once a man capable of generosity and cruelty, foresight and blindness, But if we step back and look at the larger picture, what do we see? We see a man who made the automobile something more than a rich man's toy. He made it a tool for farmers, workers, and families. He gave people freedom of movement and reshaped the geography of America. Cities spread outward into suburbs. Families went on road trips. Goods moved across highways at speeds never imagined before. Ford may not have invented the car, but he invented the car for everyone. And in doing so, he redefined modern life. Even after the Model T, his influence never truly faded. The Willow Run factory, which produced a bomber an hour during World War II, showed that his obsession with efficiency could help save the free world. The very assembly line principles he pioneered became the backbone of global industry. Whether you were building a toaster, a refrigerator, or a jet engine, you were borrowing from Henry Ford's playbook. And yet, his story also reminds us of that progress always comes at a cost. His later years showed how difficult it can be for innovators to let go, to adapt, to trust the next generation. Henry Ford, the young visionary, created a future that the older Henry Ford sometimes failed to understand. That tension between the dreamer and the stubborn old man is what makes his legacy so human. When Henry Ford died in 1947, he left behind more than a company. He left behind highways that crisscrossed nations, economies shaped by mass production, and millions of personal stories tied to their first Ford car. Some remember him as a tyrant in the WOM factory. Others remember him as the man who made their father's first car possible. Both memories are true. Henry Ford's legacy is a reminder that even the greatest innovators are not perfect. They have blind spots, contradictions, and flaws, but they also have the power to change the course of history. For Ford, his story after the Model T proves that changing the world once is never the end of the journey. It's only the beginning of the next, far more complicated chapter. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic automotive adventures. Your support keeps these stories alive.